have passed since Boudica vanished into the mists of history, but her shadow still lingers across the British Isles. You can see her name carved into monuments, hear her invoked in political speeches, and feel her presence in the stubborn spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. In London, near Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue shows her standing tall on a war chariot, flanked by her daughters. Eyes set on the horizon, wheels raised in defiance. Below her, traffic hums and tourists wander, unaware that they walk in the echoes of her rebellion. But her legacy isn't just about statues. It's about what she represents. Boudica became more than the sum of her battles. She became an eternal question asked of every empire, every oppressor, every ruler who forgets the power of the people. What happens when the silenced rise? She was not perfect. Her revolt was marked by bloodshed and massacres. Tens of thousands died at the hands of her warriors. But history isn't written by saints. It's carved by those who dare to resist. And resistance, by its nature, is rarely clean. Still, what makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome. It's the fire she lit in the human imagination. A woman who lost everything and still stood tall. A queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. A mother who turned her grief into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions, her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they won't recite footnotes. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed. The woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other. The warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise even from devastation. And in that, she becomes more than historical figure. She becomes symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable will to be free. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns. In every fight against tyranny, in every voice that dares to say no, and in every soul that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees, Boudica is gone, but her legend rides forever. To the ancients, illness was never random. It wasn't just about bacteria, viruses, or rogue cells. Those explanations would come thousands of years later. In the ancient world, sickness was a symptom not of physical failure alone, but of a deeper disturbance, a disruption in balance, a fracture in the harmony between body, mind, soul, and nature. In Mesopotamia, disease was often seen as divine punishment. If someone fell ill, it was believed they had offended a god, broken a taboo, or attracted a curse. Diagnosis began not with symptoms, but with questions. What have you done? Who have you angered? Priests and healers worked together, interpreting omens, casting spells, and prescribing rituals alongside herbal treatments. In ancient China, balance took on a more systematic meaning through yin and yang and the five elements. Health was the state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Too much heat or cold, dryness or moisture, would throw the body off. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine didn't just treat a cough. They asked when it started, what time of day it worsened, what emotions accompanied it. Healing was holistic. Herbs, acupuncture, and dietary changes were all tools to rebalance the inner cosmos. In Greece, the physician Hippocrates rejected the idea of gods punishing people with disease. Yet he too saw health as harmony. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, dominated Western medicine for centuries. Each humor was linked to a temperament and an element. An excess or deficiency of one would cause both physical symptoms and personality shifts. A melancholic person, for instance, was said to have too much black bile. Across cultures, one thread remained the same. Health meant wholeness, not just the absence of pain, but the presence of balance. Whether it was the Ayurvedic concept of doshas in India or the belief in spiritual possession in African healing traditions, ancient people understood that the human being was not isolated. We were part of nature, and nature, when disturbed, pushed back. So when ancient healers laid hands on the sick, they weren't just looking for physical signs. They were listening for imbalance. And they believed that to heal someone, you had to treat the invisible forces just as carefully as the visible wounds. In the land of pyramids and pharaohs, medicine was both science and sorcery. Ancient Egyptian healers called SWNW were not merely physicians. They were sacred intermediaries between the body and the divine. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced and yet deeply entwined with ritual and magic. To the Egyptians, the body could bleed, bruise, and break. But its ailments were never purely physical. The spirit, the gods, and even the afterlife played a role in every sickness. Much of what we know comes from medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, dated around 1550 B.C. This ancient scroll contains hundreds of remedies for everything from toothaches to tumors. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, set fractures, treated infections, and drained abscesses with copper tools sterilized by fire. They knew how to check pulses, how to observe urine and feces for diagnosis, and how to use a wide variety of herbs, many still in use today. But no treatment began without the blessing of the gods. Tom was believed to have gifted humanity the secrets of healing. Seek, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, was both feared and prayed to. She could unleash epidemics or grant recovery. Spells were often recited over a patient as herbs were applied. Words held power. Incantations weren't empty phrases. They were medicine in sound form. One of their greatest tools was honey. It was used as an antiseptic long before bacteria were understood. Wounds were bandaged with it, sometimes combined with resin or lint. Garlic and onions were prescribed for heart health. Castor oil served as a laxative. Even moldy bread was pressed into infected wounds, a primitive antibiotic centuries ahead of its time. Egyptian doctors treated not only commoners, but also royalty. Their skills were respected across borders. Neighboring civilizations would seek out Egyptian physicians for difficult cases. They were in a way early specialists. Some focused on the stomach, others on the eyes, or even on spiritual afflictions. But in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. A fever might come from the Nile's mosquitoes or from an angry ghost. Healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine balance. To the ancient Egyptian, a healer's true role wasn't just to cure the illness. It was to restore cosmic order. Long before modern medicine emerged, India was already writing its own story of healing. One that viewed the human body not as a machine, but as a reflection of the cosmos. This ancient system is known as Ayurveda, a Sanskrit word meaning the science of life. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It's a philosophy, a way of living in harmony with nature, seasons, and spirit. Central to Ayurveda is the concept of three dashas, Vata, Pa, and Kapha. Each represents a unique combination of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata governs movement. Pitta controls transformation like digestion, and Kapha manages structure and stability. Everyone is born with a unique balance of these dashas. Illness, according to, arises when this balance is disturbed by poor diet, stress, environment, or lifestyle. Ayurvedic texts like the Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita date back over 2,000 years. These detailed manuals offer not just herbal remedies but guidance on surgery, obstetrics, psychology, and even ethics for physicians. Charika focused on internal medicine, promoting prevention as the first line of defense. Sushruta, meanwhile, is remembered as a pioneer of surgery, describing over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical instruments, many carved from wood or metal. One of his most astonishing techniques was rhinoplasty, reconstructing a nose using a flap of skin from the patient's cheek or forehead. This wasn't cosmetic. It was often used to restore faces mutilated as punishment thousands of years before Western medicine caught up. Sushruta had already set the stage. But Ayurveda's strength lies in its holistic approach. Healing the body is inseparable from healing the mind and soul. Treatments include herbal medicine, yoga, breathing exercises, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and meditative fasting. Plants like turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi weren't just food. They were medicine, purifiers, and protectors of life force. An Ayurvedic healer might treat a fever not just with herbs, but by adjusting your sleep schedule, examining your emotional health, and cleansing your digestive fire or AG. Ayurveda teaches that you are not separate from nature. You are nature. And when you fall ill, it is nature's call to return to balance. In ancient China, health was never just about flesh and bone. It was about energy. The invisible vital force called qi, pronounced sedqi, flowed through every living being. And the key to wellness was ensuring that qi moved freely, without blockage or excess. This foundational idea would shape one of the oldest continuous medical systems in the world, traditional Chinese medicine or TCM. To understand illness, ancient Chinese physicians first had to understand nature itself. They observed the rhythms of the seasons, the phases of the moon, the behavior of animals, and the turning of the cosmos. From these patterns emerged two core principles, yin and yang, and the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin and yang represented balance in all things. Yin was cool, dark, passive, internal. Yang was hot, bright, active, external. Every organ, emotion, and function of the body was classified under these opposing but complementary forces. Health then was a dynamic balance between them. A fever wasn't just a rise in temperature. It was an excess of yang. Fatigue might signal a depletion of yin. Diagnosis was an art. Physicians didn't rely on tools. They relied on the senses. They examined the tongue, felt the pulse at multiple positions, listened to the tone of the voice, and asked questions about dreams, emotions, and bowel movements. Every detail offered insight into the balance or imbalance of qi. To restore health, they turned to a vast toolkit. Acupuncture, the insertion of fine needles into precise points along the body's meridians, was used to unblock qi and restore flow. Moxibustion, the burning of the mugwort herb near these points, was used to warm and stimulate circulation. Cupping, herbal formulas, qigong exercises, and strict dietary adjustments all played vital roles. The ancient text hanging, or the Yellow Emperor's inner canon compiled around 2,000 years ago, remains the foundation of TCM today. It didn't just list diseases. It explored causes, prevention, and lifestyle. It taught that emotions like anger, grief, and fear could disrupt organs, and that healing required emotional balance as well as physical remedies. Chinese medicine never separated the person from the world around them. To treat the body, one must treat the climate, the soul, and the unseen energy within. In every heartbeat, the ancients believed, qi was speaking, and the healer's task was to listen. In the temples of ancient Greece and the forums of Rome, medicine began to step away from the divine and into the realm of reason. But even here, the body was still seen as a delicate ecosystem ruled by balance and temperament. And at the center of this worldview stood a theory that would shape Western medicine for over 1,000 years. The four humors developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen. The theory proposed that the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and to a specific temperament. A healthy person had these fluids in balance. Illness, it was simply the result of too much or too little of one. If someone was feverish and aggressive, they might have excess yellow bile, a caloric imbalance. A sluggish, pale patient could be suffering from an overload of phleg linked to cold and moisture. Treatment therefore focused on restoring equilibrium through bloodletting, purging, special diets, and baths. But the Greeks didn't stop at fluids. They also believed in the healing power of observation and environment. The Hippocratic oath, still echoed in modern medicine, urged physicians to do no harm, to observe their patients carefully, and to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Hippocrates advised his students to consider the seasons, winds, water quality, and even the patient's mood. Healing sanctuaries, known as named after the god Asclepius, dotted the Greek landscape. These were more than hospitals. They were spiritual retreats. Patients slept in sacred dormitories hoping to receive healing dreams. Ritual purification, exercise, diet, and prayer were all part of the cure. It was a space where reason and religion walked hand in hand. In Rome, medical practice evolved further with the rise of Galen, a Greek physician who served gladiators and emperors. He performed dissections on animals to understand anatomy, wrote hundreds of medical texts, and helped standardize humorism across the empire. Though some of his ideas were flawed, Galen's influence endured for centuries. Greco-Roman medicine, for all its mystical origins, began pushing toward a new idea. That the human body was a system complex, yes, but knowable, and if understood correctly, it could be brought back into harmony. Not through gods alone, but through reason, ritual, and the careful art of healing. Long before written texts and formal schools of medicine, indigenous peoples around the world were healing their communities using a deeper kind of knowledge, one passed down through stories, visions, and hands-on experience with the natural world. For these cultures, medicine wasn't a profession. It was a way of life woven into daily rituals, seasonal rhythms, and sacred ceremonies. Among Native American tribes, healers were known as medicine men and women. But their role extended far beyond physical treatment. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, and keepers of ancestral knowledge. Illness was seen as a disruption in the person's relationship with nature, with the tribe, with the spirits, or with themselves. Healing required more than herbs. It required reconnection. Plants were central to this practice. From the Cherokee to the Lakota, each tribe held encyclopedic knowledge of the land, what root to chew for pain, what leaf to brew for fever, what bark to crush for wounds. Sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco were sacred, used in smudging rituals to cleanse body and spirit. Yet medicine was never just about the ingredient. It was also about intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers often worked in tandem with spiritual forces. They conducted sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Illness could be caused by a breach into bos, spiritual possession, or even soul loss, a condition where part of the individual's essence had fled due to trauma. In such cases, rituals like soul retrieval were performed, calling the spirit back through chanting, dancing, or guided trance. The same deep reverence for nature is seen in indigenous traditions across the globe. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans rely on powerful plant medicines like ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic brew used not for recreation, but for healing insight. They believe the plants themselves are teachers revealing the roots of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine includes herbs, clays, and rituals passed down through the dream time, the ancestral era that still guides indigenous identity. Healing here is about balance between body, land, ancestors, and song lines. These systems were never written in books. They lived in the songs, dances, and landscapes of the people. 2. Indigenous healers. Modern medicine may have its machines and laboratories, but the earth has always been the first pharmacy. And healing is not about defeating disease. It's about remembering who we are. Across every ancient civilization, regardless of language, geography, or belief system, there was one constant: the conviction that healing required more than herbs and surgery. It required spirit. Whether illness was seen as divine punishment, soul imbalance, or a breach with sacred forces, ancient people believed that true healing began in the unseen world, and the doorway to that world was ritual. In Mesopotamia, long before the rise of formal medicine, people turned to exorcists and priests to battle illness. Diseases were believed to be caused by malevolent spirits or offended gods. Clay tablets revealed detailed healing rites where chants were whispered as pièces were applied. Special figurines were buried beneath houses to ward off sickness. Rituals weren't separate from treatment. They were the treatment. In ancient Egypt, no physician worked without invoking the gods. Before applying honey to a wound or bandaging a limb, the healer often recited prayers to Th god of wisdom or Sekhmet, goddess of healing and wrath. Illness wasn't just a physical attack. It was a cosmic imbalance. Healing meant realigning the patient with Mahat, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. In many African traditions, healers called Ngongas or Sangomas used drumming, dancing, and divination to diagnose and
Cure.
They spoke with ancestors, summoned spirits, and often entered trance-like states to travel the spiritual realm on behalf of their patients. Herbs were important, but the unseen world was always consulted first. Even in classical Greece, ritual played a role. In the Askapa sacred healing temples, patients underwent rituals of purification, fasting, and prayer. At night, they slept in Ankoya, dreaming beneath statues of Asclepius, the god of healing. These dreams were interpreted by temple priests to guide treatment. Ritual wasn't superstition. It was structure. It gave shape to suffering, a language to pain, and a sense that the illness had meaning. Through symbolic acts, people could transform fear into hope, isolation into connection, and chaos into control. And more than that, it reminded them that they were not alone. Even today, science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief, the healing impact of intention. The ancients didn't need the data. They already understood. Sometimes a word, spoken in reverence, can heal deeper than any blade. Because not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine is made of matter. When we think of ancient surgery, we often imagine crude tools, trembling hands, and unbearable pain. But the truth is far more impressive and more human. Across the ancient world, surgery was practiced with surprising precision. These early healers didn't have anesthesia, x-rays, or antiseptics. But they had skill, courage, and a remarkable understanding of the body earned through generations of observation, trial, and often brutal necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, detailed more than 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is considered the father of surgery. He described techniques for removing tumors, setting bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, a form of plastic surgery. His tools were sharp, varied, and carefully categorized. Forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles, many made of iron or stone. Sushruta emphasized hygiene, surgical preparation, and the importance of understanding anatomy through dissection. Though this was often limited to animals, his surgical wisdom spread far beyond India, influencing both Islamic and Western practices centuries later. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge blended with ritual. Papyrus texts reveal procedures for stitching wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Tools like bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods have been found in tombs. They even practiced trepidation, cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, or treat head injuries. Amazingly, many skulls show signs of healing, meaning the patients survived. Trepidation wasn't limited to Egypt. In precolumbian Peru, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of trap skulls, often from warriors wounded in battle. Some surgeries were shockingly successful. In certain regions, over 80% of patients survived based on bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used cocoa leaves or fermented maize beer to dull pain along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen advanced surgical techniques by studying injured gladiators and dissecting animals. His insights into the nervous system and vascular pathways laid foundations for later anatomy. Roman military surgeons treated wounds on the battlefield with efficiency using cautery clamps and ligatures. While surgery was always dangerous, it was also respected. It was the domain of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hoping to draw health from pain. These weren't butchers. They were artists of the blade. And though their knowledge was incomplete, their legacy lives on every time a scalpel is raised in healing, not harm. Today, we live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic mapping. We can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across oceans with a tap. And yet, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world still echo. You can find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas in pharmacy aisles, and indigenous smudging ceremonies held in hospitals to honor patients' traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman predecessors once did. In operating rooms, we use precision tools that trace their lineage back to Sushuta's iron instruments. Concepts like holistic care, preventative medicine, and mind-body connection now cornerstones of integrative health, are rooted in the wisdom of ancient civilizations who saw healing not as a task but as a relationship. Even modern science has come full circle. Research increasingly confirms what the ancients believed, that stress, isolation, and emotional trauma can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep, and cause physical pain. Meditation, once a spiritual discipline, is now studied for its effects on brain health. Forest bathing, derived from Shinto and indigenous nature practices, is prescribed for anxiety. And the placebo effect, healing powered by belief, continues to puzzle researchers who once dismissed it. It's easy to see ancient medicine as outdated, superstition, folklore, primitive guesswork. But when we look closer, we see something profound. A worldview that treated illness not just as a broken machine, but as a disruption in being. A signal that something somewhere was out of harmony. And that idea still matters because medicine isn't only about treatment. It's about meaning, about comfort, about being seen and understood. The ancients knew this instinctively. Whether they used chants, needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was sacred. Today, as we push further into the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind. Perhaps we are returning to it with new tools, but the same human heart. A heart that still longs for balance, for wholeness, for healing, not just of body, but of spirit. Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody. Sappho, a poetess from the island of Lesbos, born sometime around 630 B.C., whose voice once stirred the hearts of listeners under starlit skies, and whose words, even in fragments, still echo with longing. Unlike the grand warriors and kings of ancient Greece, Sappho's fame came not from conquest, but from emotion. Her domain was not the battlefield, but the human soul. She wrote of love and jealousy, beauty and despair, joy and yearning. She captured the fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a tremble, and held them in verse like pressed flowers, fragile yet eternal. Very little is known of her life, no portraits, no diaries. What we have are traces, a few lines preserved by ancient scholars, quotes embedded in other works, and the ruins of papyrus scrolls lost to time. And yet these fragments shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would seek her, piecing her life together like an unfinished song. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Ionian Sea. This was a place of music and learning where poetry was woven into the fabric of social life. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and even political enemies, though the records are vague. She lived through exile and unrest, moments of silence and moments of song. Her world was one where most women's voices were confined to the home or stifled altogether. But Sappho defied silence. She stood apart, not with rebellion, but with beauty. She wrote in the Aeolic dialect, in short, vivid lyrics designed to be sung to the lyre. Her style was intimate, rich with imagery. Evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered. Words like these outlived empires. And then, as quietly as she appeared in the records, she faded. Much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or dismissed. But what remains proves one thing. She didn't need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today when we speak of passion in verse, of love without shame, of longing that defies centuries, we are still whispering the name Sappho. To understand Sappho, you must first understand Lesbos, the island that cradled her voice. Lesbos was no backwater. In the ancient Greek world, it was a flourishing hub of art, music, and philosophy. With its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal winds scented with salt and flowers, Lesbos was both a physical paradise and a cultural gem. It wasn't Athens. It didn't need to be. It had its own rhythm, slower, more sensual, and steeped in lyric tradition. Here, music wasn't decoration. It was devotion. The lyre and ouz echoed through homes and temples. Poetry was sung, not read. And In this world of sound and nature, Sappho's voice was born. She lived in the city of Mytilene, the island's bustling heart. Politics thrived here, and so did art. The island boasted poets and philosophers, rival factions, and shifting alliances. Sappho herself was once exiled, perhaps to Sicily, amid political unrest. But it was always Lesbos that drew her home. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a space of female community rare in the ancient world. Aristocratic girls were educated in music, poetry, and ritual. Some scholars believe Sappho led a kind of thesos, a circle or school where young women learned the art of lyric poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. This was not formal education as we know it, but a sacred creative sisterhood. Here, bonds formed that were emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract muses, but as real presences in her life. She addressed them by name, mourned their departures, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love. With searing honesty. In one fragment, she writes, "I have not had one word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me." These lines don't come from myth or theater. They come from a lived world, a circle of women singing by lamplight, weaving emotion into song. And though time would later distort her legacy, framing it with scandal or speculation, Lesbos was the soil from which her truth grew, not just a location on a map, but a cultural cradle of passion, artistry, and female expression. Sappho didn't just live on Lesbos. She became Lesbos. Its breath, its heart, its voice. In an age when the great epics of Homer praised gods and heroes and men filled scrolls with battles and conquests, Sappho wrote about the heart. She didn't sing of war. She sang of a trembling hand, a shy glance, a voice that made her body shiver. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write in the first-person I, not just narrating events, but feeling them. And what she felt was love, longing, jealousy, tenderness, and desire. Most astonishing of all, she wrote as a woman to women about women. In ancient Greece, a woman's voice was often confined to the home or silenced entirely. Public life, literature, politics, philosophy, these belonged to men. But Sappho stepped outside those walls, not with rebellion, but with rhythm. Her poetry did not demand space. It created its own, a private universe where emotion was not weakness, but power. And within that space, she did something radical. She named the women she loved. She didn't reduce them to symbols. She didn't speak in metaphor alone. She remembered their laughter, their perfume, the way they braided their hair. In one fragment, she describes the sensation of seeing a beloved. He is equal to the gods. That man who sits beside you, who listens to your sweet voice and watches your lovely laughter. Oh, it makes my heart beat fast. Here, Sappho is the onlooker, watching the woman she admires speak to another. Her jealousy is quiet, aching, deeply human. In just a few lines, she captures the full weight of unrequited love, something every listener then or now can understand. Her words carried the erotic, but never the vulgar. She wrote of sensuality with the care of a painter, the curve of a neck, the softness of sleep, the way moonlight touched skin. She didn't separate beauty from intimacy. They were one. Because of this, later centuries often misunderstood or censored her. Some tried to erase her queerness. Others mythologized her heartbreak into tragedy. But none of that diminishes the truth of her voice. A woman who wrote, honestly, lyrically, and bravely about love, not in theory, but as someone who had lived it deeply, openly, and without apology. Sappho didn't just write poetry. She composed music for the soul. Her verses were never meant for silent reading. In ancient Greece, poetry was alive. It was sound, breath, vibration. Sappho's form was the lyric, short and intensely personal, meant to be performed with a lyre, a small stringed instrument cradled in the lap, plucked gently while the voice carried the words. Like a breeze over the sea. This was the heart of lyric poetry, and it's where the word lyrical comes from. The poetry wasn't epic. It didn't tell long tales of war, and gods. It was intimate, emotional, and immediate. The lyric was a whisper, a confession, a love letter sung beneath fig trees or in candlelit rooms. And Sappho was its undisputed master. Her poems were crafted in Aeolic Greek, a regional dialect rich in softness and rhythm. Her preferred meter, now called the Sapphic stanza, flowed with a particular beat. 3 long lines followed by a shorter punchy one, like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. It was subtle and musical, like the rising and falling of breath during a quiet moment between lovers. She would have performed these songs surrounded by women, students, companions, maybe even priestesses. These gatherings, possibly ritual or educational in nature, were also spaces of freedom, spaces where emotion, song, and body were not fragmented, but whole. Through these performances, Sappho trained others in the art of composition, creating not just poems, but a culture. We can only imagine what it sounded like. The soft twang of strings, the clear rise of her voice, the stillness of listeners hanging on each syllable. Many of her poems open not with statements, but with questions or invocations like the start of a conversation or a prayer. Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. These were poems that reached up to gods and inward to desire, and yet they feel surprisingly modern. You could set them to music today, and they'd still stir something raw and real. Sappho turned poetry into song. And in doing so, she reminded the world that emotion is music, that every heartache, every thrill of touch or tremble of voice deserves a melody. And hers is one still echoing centuries later. For every line of Sappho's poetry we have today, dozens, perhaps hundreds, are lost. What remains are fragments, shards of emotion and sound, phrases ripped from their original songs, drifting across time. Some are complete stanzas, others are mere whispers, a single word, a sliver of longing, a closing thought without a beginning. And yet even these broken pieces pulse with life, like embers glowing in the ash of something once brilliant. Why did so much vanish? Time, war, and deliberate destruction. Sappho's works were once collected into 9 volumes, organized in the famed Library of Alexandria. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. But with the fall of that library, much of ancient literature was lost. Later, as Christian influence rose, many works deemed pagan or immoral were suppressed, neglected, or intentionally burned. Sappho's poetry, filled with passion, especially same-sex love, made her a target. By the medieval period, she became a ghost. Her name survived, but her voice was nearly silenced. Only through quotations by other authors preserved in grammars, commentaries, or philosophical works did bits of her poetry escape extinction. These fragments were often cited for their style or vocabulary, not for their emotional force. Yet the feelings still bled through. Then came the papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists digging in the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts, among them torn and faded lines of Sappho, bits of songs that had not been seen for over 1,000 years. More discoveries followed. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found on a papyrus wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each recovery felt like a resurrection. And yet, so much remains missing. We read her today in Echoes. What we long for is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history had let her speak without interruption. Still, there's something hauntingly fitting in this survival through fragments. Sappho wrote about impermanence, about fleeting moments, about beauty that slips through the fingers like sand. And so perhaps it is appropriate that her poetry arrives to us not as a monument, but as a mystery, a puzzle pieced together by lovers of language, of music, of the heart. A voice once drowned in fire still burning. Sappho's poetry was too honest to escape judgment. In her lifetime, she was admired, celebrated even as a master of lyric poetry. Plato called her the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. Yet, as centuries passed and cultures shifted, her legacy became twisted, silenced, or scandalized depending on the times.
Why?
Because she wrote about love, and not the kind history was comfortable remembering. Much of her poetry centers on deep affection and desire for women. She praised their beauty, mourned their absence, confessed jealousy, and celebrated their intimacy. In her world, this was not strange. In the cultural setting of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, close emotional and possibly romantic bonds were accepted, even honored. But later generations, especially under Roman, Christian, and Victorian values, struggled with this. Rather than confront her truth, they rewrote her story. Medieval scribes ignored her. Renaissance translators softened her language. Victorians labeled her a tragic romantic, heartbroken over a man, even inventing the myth that she leapt to her death from a cliff over the love of a ferryman named Fionn. A tale that appears nowhere in her authentic work. This invented story served a purpose to erase her queerness, to make her pain more palatable, her desires more conventional. Some critics reduced her poetry to merely educational or platonic. Others dismissed her altogether as indecent, and yet she
Persisted.
even in scandal, Sappho's name survived. In the 19th century, when open discussion of same-sex love was still taboo, her legacy quietly became a coded symbol for queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian became terms for romantic love between women, rooted directly in her name and her home. She became, without ever intending to, a figure of resistance, a poetic ancestor to those whose loves were silenced. And still today, debates echo.
Who is she?
A teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat? But maybe the better question is, why are we still afraid of her truth? Sappho didn't write to fit into categories. She wrote what she felt. She named beauty, confessed longing, and lived through verse. Her scandal wasn't in her actions. It was in her honesty. She dared to write desire, and for that history tried to muffle her voice, but it never could. If there was one divine presence that hovered over Sappho's life and work, it was Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't just a myth. She was a muse, a confidant, even a kind of companion in moments of passion and heartbreak. Many of Sappho's most powerful verses are not just about love. They are prayers to Aphrodite, invocations, pleas, arguments made in verse when the weight of longing became too much to bear. In her most famous surviving poem, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho doesn't simply praise the goddess. She speaks to her directly, almost like a friend who's heard this pain before.
Come to me now.
If ever you have answered my voice in the past, free me from hard care. Fulfill all that my heart longs to achieve. There is no shame in this vulnerability, no fear in expressing desire. Sappho's love is never portrayed as sinful or weak. It is divine, something sacred enough to bring a goddess down from the heavens. In the ancient world, Aphrodite wasn't just about romance. She ruled over attraction, seduction, the chemistry between bodies, the ache of separation. To call on her was to recognize that love could wound just as much as it could thrill. Sappho captured that duality perfectly. She didn't idealize love. She lived inside its contradictions. She wrote of its sweetness and its sting, its beauty and its cruelty. In another poem, she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain, troubling the oak trees." Here, love isn't gentle. It's violent, elemental, something that tears through the self without asking permission. By placing Aphrodite at the center of her emotional world, Sappho elevated longing into something mythic. Her poems blurred the line between the personal and the divine, between everyday emotion and cosmic force. And in doing so, she helped build a literary legacy where love wasn't just a theme. It was a form of worship. For Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't an abstract deity. She was a mirror, a force that reflected back all the intensity, the confusion, and the beauty of the human heart. And in every line of Sappho's verse, the goddess of love listens and replies. Like her poetry, Sappho's death is a mystery wrapped in myth. No one knows exactly when she died, how old she was, or even where she spent her final years. Some say she died peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and the songs she loved. Others, especially later Roman poets, spun tragic fables that she leapt to her death from the white cliffs of Lafada, heartbroken over an unrequited love for the handsome ferryman Fionn. But there's no historical evidence for that story. It seems more like an invention, a way for a male-dominated literary tradition to reframe her love and suffering into a heterosexual tragedy. It turned the powerful poetic voice of a woman who loved women into a victim of unreturned affection for a man. A neat ending perhaps, but a false one. The truth is simpler and more profound. Sappho disappeared as quietly as she arrived. After her death, her work lived on for centuries. She was studied by philosophers, quoted by playwrights, and sung in performances across the ancient Greek world. Her poetry was preserved in 9 books, a treasure trove of lyric verse. For a time, her fame rivaled Homer's. But history is not kind to voices that challenge its norms. With the rise of the Roman Empire and later the dominance of Christian moral codes, Sappho's openly emotional and sensual poems, especially those celebrating female love, fell out of favor. Her writings were no longer recopied. Her volumes left to decay in libraries that would eventually burn or crumble. Some believe her works were intentionally destroyed by early church officials who saw her songs as dangerous. By the Middle Ages, her name remained, but her words were mostly gone. It would take over 1,000 years before fragments of her verses resurfaced, unearthed from Egyptian trash heaps or quoted in ancient grammars. Piece by piece, she was reborn, not through myth, but through survival. Her death may be lost to time, but her disappearance was never total. She lingered in whispers, in stolen lines scribbled in margins, in the persistent ache of voices that refused to be forgotten. Sappho didn't need a heroic death. Her poems were already immortal, and in the gaps where her words once lived, we can still feel the shape of her spirit. Yearning, unfinished, but never truly gone. Sappho's life may be lost in shadows, her verses scattered and incomplete, but her influence has never dimmed. If anything, it has only grown stronger, like a candle that flickers but refuses to go out. In every age, someone has rediscovered her. In the Renaissance, scholars pored over her fragments, marveling at her delicate command of emotion. In the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley invoked her name. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as conversations around gender and identity began to reawaken, Sappho became a symbol of queer resilience, of feminine artistry, of emotional freedom. Her name lives on in language itself. Sapphic used to describe romantic love between women. Lesbian taken from the island of her birth, now a global identity. These words are not just terms. They are echoes of her life. Proof that a voice can ripple across millennia and still reshape how we understand love and expression. Artists, writers, and musicians continue to be drawn to her. Painters have imagined her at the lyre bathed in moonlight. Poets have translated her again and again, each version seeking the pulse beneath the words. Modern authors have reimagined her, reclaimed her, resurrected her in novels, songs, and plays. And through it all, one thing remains clear. Sappho speaks to something universal. It doesn't matter that her poems are broken. It doesn't matter that her biography is blurred. What matters is the emotion that burns beneath the words. The trembling joy of desire, the ache of separation, the sacredness of beauty. These are feelings we all carry. She just found a way to sing them. Perhaps that's her true immortality. Not the marble statues or the scholarly footnotes, but the way a few lines from over 2,000 years ago can still make someone pause, breathe, and feel less alone. Sappho's gift was never just poetry. It was presence. She made feeling an art. She made longing a form of truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror for anyone who has ever loved quietly, deeply, or in defiance of the world. And as long as human hearts break and heal through language, Sappho will remain. Not just remembered, but felt.